Welcome to our ninth lesson in the series of 12 on In the Beginning, looking at the first 11 chapters of the book of Genesis. Before we get into our lesson for today, let's do a quick review of where we are up to this point in this section of the book. At the end of chapter 5, we were introduced to Noah, and that he had 3 sons, Shem, Ham, and Japheth. Conditions on the earth were going from bad to worse, so God determined to destroy his creation. We saw the cryptic 120 years, which seems to be the amount of time before this happened. But there was one person and his family who were different, and that is Noah. Noah was faithful to God. And because he was faithful, God would spare him and his faithful family. God gave him instructions to construct a large boat so that he and his family, as well as representative animals, would be spared the extinction that was about to happen. And God would start over with all that were on the ark. Noah did exactly what God told him to do. It would seem that it took about 100 years to build this huge boat. Noah built the ark, and the representative animals were put into the ark along with sufficient supplies. 7 pair of clean animals were put into the ark, plus a pair of unclean. It took a week after God's warning that it was about to happen to get everything, including themselves, on board. And then the rain started. It rained for 40 days and nights, which seems to indicate continuous rain. The waters rose and the ark floated above the flood. All life on the earth was killed. And the waters kept rising, and the tops of the mountains were covered to a depth of around 20 feet. That's close to 7 meters. The waters prevailed for 150 days. And that's where we concluded in our last lesson at the end of chapter 7. In this study, we're going to concentrate on chapter 8, which gives the details of the waters receding so that Noah, his family, and the animals could leave the ark. An outline of this section might look something like this. First 5 verses talks about the ark settling on the mountains of Ararat. Verses 6 through 12, birds were sent out by Noah to see if the waters were gone. Verses 13 to 19, Noah and the animals were told to leave and multiply. And verses 20 to 22, God promised not to curse the ground again because of people. So let's get into our text. Genesis 8, first 5 verses. God remembered Noah and all the wild animals and all the livestock that were with him in the ship. God caused a wind to blow over the earth, the waters began receding. The springs of the undersea and the floodgates of the skies were shut, and the gushing rain stopped. The flood waters gradually subsided from the earth, decreasing for 150 days. The ship touched down on the mountains of Ararat on the 7th day of the 7th month. The waters continued to abate until the 10th month. On the first day of the 10th month, the mountain tops were visible. I often wonder, what did they do on board the ark during this time? Bill Gresham writes, the Bible says nothing of how the passengers aboard the ark ate or slept or spent their days. It gives no description of the sights, sounds, or smells Noah's family experienced for months as God cleansed the world of its sinful inhabitants. The 8 passengers who were on the ark with the animals God was preserving may have wondered if God had forgotten about them. Can you imagine what it would have been like to be cooped up, even though it was a big boat, but to be cooped up, no sunshine, and just day after day after day, month after month on board? You would wonder, is it ever going to end? The earth, by the way, seems to have been quite a bit warmer before the flood, so this idea of this wind may be a new feature in Earth's weather systems, and it could indicate the beginning of weather patterns as we know them today. But God hadn't forgotten Noah and those on board the ark. He remembered, and that word's interesting when used in relation to God, because God doesn't forget. The Hebrew word is zakar, and it refers to God beginning to act on someone's behalf, this time for Noah and his family. He caused a wind to blow to help the waters subside. God used wind later, by the way, when Israel was about to cross the Red Sea, didn't he? To part the waters and dry up the ground. Having said that, I don't think the text is implying that the wind evaporated all the water needed for the flood to recede. This was probably when God reshaped the earth by dropping the ocean basins, raising the mountains. It's also possibly the time that the continents continued to move into the positions where we now find them. A little reminder here, we saw this in chapter 1. The Hebrew, as well as later on the Greek words for wind, is the same word that's translated spirit. In Hebrew, it's ruach, although here it's referring to a physical wind. But in addition to that, God shut off the water as well, both the underground sources of water as well as the water coming from the skies, the floodgates of the skies. Bill Grasham points out that the verb forms in verse 2 that are translated were closed and was restrained are both passive, indicating that the stopping of the waters was not something that happened naturally or accidentally. These terms reflect divine activity and shutting off the various sources of additional water. It took 150 days for the waters to decrease, at which point the ark grounded on Mount Ararat. Keep in mind that there was still water all around it, but that it had now settled onto the ground. Mount Ararat itself is 17,000 feet high, but notice the text. It's the mountains of Ararat. So this could be anywhere in this chain of mountains, this mountain region in the Ararat area. And this, I thought this was a nice little video that I found on Wikipedia showing that this huge range. It very well could have been on top, that peak in the center that the ark settled, but we can't be sure. Many think that the actual place might be Urartu, a mountainous land north of Mesopotamia near Lake Van in Armenia. This may be a more realistic location, as the term Ararat in the Bible refers not to a mountain but to a region, which today would be roughly equivalent to Armenia. It is said that the mountains in this region, which seem to include what we often refer to as Mount Ararat, are perpetually under snow. Although it's with the warming that we're having these days, it's not totally under snow all the time now. The ark grounded on the 17th day of the 7th month. That's about 6 months after the flood began. On the first day of the 10th month, that's 2.5 months later, the tops of the mountains were finally seen. I'm assuming seen from the ark. The word here means they were distinctly visible. So at grounds, there has still been water because it was not a small boat. It grounded. Then it took a while for the water to continue going down until the tops of the mountains could be seen. After 40 days, Noah opened the windows of the ship and he sent out a crow, which flew back and forth until the waters were dried up from the earth. Also, he sent out a dove to see if the waters were gone from the ground. But the dove did not find a resting place for her feet, and she returned to him the ship, for the waters were still on the earth. He reached out, took hold of her, and brought her into the ship. Noah waited for a week and again sent out the dove. She returned in the evening with a freshly plucked olive leaf in her beak. So he knew that the waters had receded from the earth. He waited yet another week and sent her out again, but she did not come back. So 40 more days passed, about a month and a half, and Noah opened the window. Bill Grasham commented on this part of the ark. He said, a straightforward reading of the account suggests that Noah was hesitant to leave the ark until he was certain that the time was right. He no doubt wanted to be sure that it was safe before the passengers disembarked, not only the humans, but also the other living creatures within the vessel. And this window may have been more of a hatch, as he doesn't seem to have been able to see the waters receding or the land below. He's just seeing the tops of just seeing the mountains. He sends out a raven. McCord translated that crow. They're of the same family. And it did not return. We'll comment on why a bit later. Then later he sent out a dove. But the dove returned, not finding any place to set her foot. He waited 7 more days and sent her out again. The dove brought back a freshly plucked olive leaf, indicating that plants were now growing above the water's surface. He waited 7 more days, sent her out again, and she didn't return, evidently discovering that the world was now suitable for living and surviving. Although the dove is a symbol of peace today, Peter Williams in his commentary refers to it in that context as a symbol of peace. But really in the Bible, it's a symbol of a new beginning. Here it's the start of a new creation. Think about the dove in relation to when Jesus was baptized. That was a symbol of a new era in our relationship with God. So, why did the raven not return? Well, it's been pointed out that ravens, crows, would be able to land and feed off the floating debris and carcasses. A dove wouldn't do that. Why did Noah even need to send birds out? There's no evidence that God had communicated with him until later. That's recorded in verse 15. Sending out the birds was his only way to find out how dry the earth was becoming. Notice as well the use of 7 throughout this section in relation to the days. Some have pointed out the symbolic nature of number 7, and that's very true. 7 refers to completeness, but I have no doubt that these were 7 literal days. I think that's why McCord translated it a week rather than 7 days. That amount of time was probably chosen by God because it symbolized that God's ways are complete. They were given time to fully develop. In the 601st year of the first month, on the first day of the month, the waters drained off the earth. Then Noah removed the ship's covering, and he saw that the surface of the ground was drained. Then the second month, on the 27th day of the month, the earth was dry. God said to Noah, "Leave the ship, you and your wife and your sons and their wives, also all the living creatures that are with you, the birds, the animals, the creeping things. Bring out that they may increase and be fruitful and multiply on the earth." So Noah went out, and his sons and his wife and the sons' wives with him. All the animals, the creeping things, and the birds, according to their families, left the ship. So it's been a year since Noah and his family entered the ark. The waters were now drained from the earth, but almost 2 more months passed before the ground was totally dry, able to support humans once again taking up residence, as well as the heaviest of the animals. And you can imagine how sodden the ground was. Our back garden here in Scotland is pretty sodden. It's been raining a lot this winter. It'll take weeks for it to dry out. So we can understand why it took months for the earth to continue drying out until it was totally dry. But God then told Noah that it was time to leave the ark. Noah and his family would have stepped into a pure, clean world. God told Noah to bring out the animals so that they could be fruitful and multiply, and that includes the humans. The animals left the ark by families. Bill Gresham commented on this, and he said, in a sense, Noah was a new Adam. He and his family were to make a new start and a new creation. The same was true for the animals. They were to be fruitful and multiply on the earth once again. Have you ever thought about Noah and his family and the animals were in the ark for somewhere around a year or just a little bit more? By my calculation, possibly around 370 days. If you remember back in chapter 7, we had a very specific time when everything started. It's in Genesis 7:11. It was on the 600th year of Noah's life, the second month, 17th day, that he and his family entered the ark. Of course, the animals entered the ark, and the rain started. So very, very precise date there. And we find here in this chapter that it was in Noah's 601st year, second month, 27th day, that the earth was completely dry, and Noah's family and the animals left the ark. So it sounds like about a year and about 10 days. But so it's definitely 1 year. But as these are lunar months, different from our months, you end up with somewhere between 370 days, they were on the ark if a month was 30 days, or about 364 days if a month was roughly 29 and a half days. I'm not sure how they calculated time back then, but we can easily say they were on the ark for well over a year without any problem. Notice what the first thing Noah did when he came out of the ark. Noah built an altar to Yahweh and placed clean animals and clean birds upon it as whole burnt offerings. Yahweh smelled the delightful aroma and said in his heart, "Never again will I curse the ground because of mankind. For the inclination of people's heart is evil from their youth. Never again will I destroy all life as I did. While the earth exists, seedtime and harvest, cold and heat, summer and winter, day and night shall never cease." So the first thing he does is builds an altar, and the text says he took one of every clean animal and bird and offered a burnt offering to God. Bill Gresham writes, in view of the divine deliverance from the flood, the natural and appropriate response of men was worship. Noah demonstrated great gratitude by building an altar to the Lord and offering sacrifices of every clean animal and bird to him. So first thing he does after leaving the ark. By the way, we can now see why he took extra clean animals, can't we? This is the first reference, by the way, in the Bible to an altar being used to offer sacrifices. I don't believe it really is the first one. This is the first one that's mentioned. But this sacrifice pleased God, as pleasing odors delight us. This is the only time in Scripture that it mentions God smelling the sacrifice. We find later on with Israel in the wilderness that sacrifices were to rise as a sweet aroma, but not that God was smelling them. But the implication in all of that is that he accepted the sacrifice. The burnt offering is the most selfless sacrifice that could be offered because the entire animal was offered to God. In most sacrifices under the Mosaic covenant, part of the animal was offered and the rest cooked and eaten as basically a fellowship meal with God. Bill Gresham contrasts this. Unlike what was done with other kinds of sacrifices in ancient times, the worshiper did not receive part of this offering to eat. The entire animal was consumed on the altar, signifying the total devotion and consecration of the individual to the Lord. Noah's sacrifices were pleasing to God because they represented a life totally dedicated to Him. God promised that He would never again curse the ground because of man and destroy every living thing. Notice that He said this in His heart. He said this to Himself. And notice why He said He would never do this again. It wasn't because people had learned their lesson and wouldn't be that bad again. It wasn't because humans had been terrified by God's awful judgment and would stay in line from then on. But it was because people would do it again. The imagination of man's heart is evil from his youth, the text tells us. If God continued to react in the same way, He would have to continually cleanse the earth. It was because man is so bad that God chose not to do such a thing again. Instead, there would be a natural, if you will, rhythm to life of winter and summer, cold and hot, seed time and harvest. We'll see more about this promise, this covenant that God makes in our next lesson in chapter 9. Bill Gresham wrote, regardless of how unpredictable and unstable the human heart may be, a measure of reliability and stability will always exist in the cycle of God's renewed world. These were necessary to sustain life, and they served as evidence that the world was still entirely under God's control and blessing. There were changes in the earth following the flood. The earth is now watered by rain rather than a mist. The earth's climate was changed from being more of a warmer greenhouse before the flood. And we can see all of this because we found plants frozen in Antarctica, also plant fossils in desert regions. It seems that following the flood, there was ice and very much a non-uniform climate. The first mention in the Bible of wind, by the way, is in chapter 8, verse 1, which would cause weather patterns to form. The number of years people were living changed from before the flood to being much shorter after the flood. It's said that possibly a warmer climate would have aided in longevity. Other factors probably came into play as well. We'll look at that more when we see the next set of genealogies. The mountains and valleys could have formed during and just after the flood due to the immense pressure of water and the runoff as waters abated. There's reference to these, by the way, in the Bible as well. In particular, Psalm 104, beginning at verse 5. He, referring to God, laid the foundation of the earth that it should never be moved. You covered it with the oceans as a garment. The waters stood above the mountains. By your restraint, the waters receded. At the sound of your thunder, they ran away. The mountains arose, the valleys sank, the place which you arranged for them. You placed an impassable boundary for them, so that the earth would not be flooded. Initially, when reading that, it might sound like it's talking about God creating, what He did during the creation. But as you read on down through it, you discover that this is talking about the flood. Psalm 104 is referring to the aftermath of the flood and gives some details as to what happened. Rather than making all the waters go away, God just adjusted the earth. He raised the mountains and lowered the valleys, creating a place for the waters to go. Isaiah even refers to the oceans we have today as the waters of Noah in Isaiah 54, verse 9. Probably the formation of coal and diamonds and fossils took place during the flood. These substances, we are told, are formed by a combination of pressure and time. If you increase one, by the way, the other one decreases. And we know even today we can form coal in a matter of seconds using extreme pressure, and of course lots of money to do that. The oceans would now be much more extensive due to their containing the waters of the flood, as well as the water that had been present since the creation. And it would seem that the end of the flood brought with it an ice age, which lasted for quite a few more years. Good scientific reasons why this would happen, due to the atmosphere, as this chart here, this drawing from Andrewes in Genesis, points out. But this also explains that some of the water would have frozen at the poles as well as in glaciers. With plenty of room and therefore a lack of competition, the animals would have multiplied very rapidly. By the way, we see similar things happen today with a volcano, such as Mount St. Helens in the state of Washington, when it blew back in 1980. This picture here of Mount St. Helens is from 1982, 2 years after the eruption. Mount St. Helens devastated that landscape, also caused quite a flood during that time period. More than 200 square miles, over 500 square kilometers of what had been pristine forest, you can see in the top picture, became a wasteland of fallen timber covered in gray ash. Although many of the dead trees are still standing, as you can see from this photograph, you can see that the area around it's now green. The landscape quickly recovered. Within 3 years of that eruption, 90% of the original plant species were regrowing. It took only 20 years following the eruption for the animal population to reach the level that was there in 1980. They discovered that the reproductive rates of return to animals were higher than normal. 20 years after the eruption, the area was approaching its pre-eruption level of animals and plants. With their settling in ecological niches and breeding occurring within their population, we'd also rapidly see the variation of species taking place in each kind and becoming established in their environments in the world after the flood. It doesn't take long for a population to reestablish itself. I thought one more question might be interesting to deal with. Is the Ark still on top of Mount Ararat? This map of the region, by the way, dates from 1492, and no, the Ark wasn't there at the time. Question is, which peak are we going to look at? We don't know the exact location where the Ark landed. It would appear to be one of the mountains, maybe a tall mountain, but had the mountains even finished their upward thrust due to isostasy yet? Keep in mind the Ark was made of wood. This depiction, by the way, of Mount Ararat dates from 1686, and no, the Ark was still not there at that time. To preserve wood, it would have to be buried in water, because wood, if left out on its own, exposed to the elements, would eventually disintegrate, unless it was in a very hot, sterile environment, like what we see in the pyramids of Egypt. Now, we know that wood buried in water can be preserved. We see that in Flag Fen down in Cambridgeshire. But the Ark wasn't buried in water. It's on top of the mountains. Ice could preserve it there, which it would probably have done during the Ice Age that seems to have occurred just after the flood. The photos of the rough area today show that it's no longer snow-covered year-round. So throughout most of the time since the flood, it would have been exposed to elements and would have disintegrated. Plus, if you think about it, Noah and his family could have used some of it to burn for fuel or to build their own houses from. Despite those who claim to have found it, I see no evidence to suggest that it's still there. In fact, Bill Grasham pointed this out. Zealous individuals have brought back pieces of wood that were supposedly part of the ark. When subjected to carbon-14 dating, all of these have proved disappointing to the explorers, rendering dates of about the 5th century AD or later, thousands of years too young to be from the time of Noah. Anyway, let's look at some lessons, a few lessons that we can learn from this particular chapter. We saw that Noah trusted God and he waited patiently in the ark. Isn't that what we also have to do as we wait for Jesus' coming? Bill Grasham says Noah apparently did not complain because of the long months at sea. Neither did he lose faith or accuse the Lord of forsaking his family because he had not spoken for about a year. And maybe that leads us to a second lesson. We need to wait patiently without grumbling. We tend to be good grumblers, don't we? But we need to learn to wait patiently. God will do everything in his own time, and God will do everything at the right time. Another lesson. We need to be thankful, as Noah was when he came out of the ark. Again, Bill Grasham said Noah left the ark in thankfulness for God's mercy and grace. Grace that had saved him and all the inhabitants of the vessel from the turbulent waters of the flood. The natural response of this great deliverance was for Noah, out of gratitude and praise, to worship by offering birds and animals as sacrifice to the Lord. God desires in his people today the same attitude that Noah displayed. How thankful are we for all the great blessings that we have because of Jesus? And just a reminder, our lives are to be a living sacrifice. We don't offer animal sacrifices in Thanksgiving. We give our very lives. Paul wrote to the Romans, "Therefore, brothers, I beg you through the mercies of God to offer your bodies as living sacrifices, dedicated and well-pleasing to God, which is your spiritual service." And he writes in Philippians, "It's not that I seek the gift, but I seek the fruit that increases to your account. I have all things and I abound. I'm filled, having received from Epaphroditus the things from you, a fragrant aroma, an acceptable sacrifice, well-pleasing to God." So Paul here referred to the gifts that he was given to help support him as a sacrifice. That's part of what we give when we give our lives. We also provide what's needed if people need anything in particular. And of course, I think an obvious lesson, as Noah and his family were saved through water, we also are saved through water today. Peter wrote about this. In the ark, that is 8 souls, were brought safely through the water. This was a figure of the washing which now saves you, not the removal of dirt from the body, but the earnest request to God for a clear conscience through the resurrection of Jesus Christ. Bill Grasham commented on this. He said, "The survivors who came out of the ark owed their salvation to God, since it was his grace that had saved them and given them a good conscience for a new life in a cleansed world. Even so, penitent believers are saved by grace through faith when they're baptized into Christ. They make an appeal to God for a good conscience through the resurrection of Jesus Christ." Next week, we'll continue this. The story has not ended yet. We'll get into chapter 9. We have more details of this covenant, this promise that God made to the earth and the sign that he gave, as well as more information on Noah and his family in the years following the flood. We hope you'll join us for that particular lesson.